Yeah. So the second question is actually, I actually left the easy question for last because it's easy because it's a historical question, right? So Guerrero and Veracruz today have the largest population
Okay.
for the historical reason that those were the ports, especially Veracruz was where slaves came in. There was also a lot of blacks involved in the work of the port in both Guerrero and Veracruz.
Okay.
And then there was in the 17th century, there was a large black population in Mexican cities, Mexico City, Puebla, Valladolid, today's Morelia, and Querétaro, Michoacán, other places. The ports always had more people because of it was, you know, they were so in Acapulco, the ship that was taking things to Spain, right, from Peru, went up to Acapulco, and then the thing went across to Veracruz, right?
Okay.
So there was a lot of also the Manila galleon arriving in Acapulco, so all of this, and then in Veracruz the Atlantic traffic of ships, and black people were involved in this work and also lived in Veracruz. A large black community developed, which is still there in Guerrero and Veracruz. And Guerrero is named Guerrero because Vicente Guerrero, who is one of the father of Mexican independence, who fought for Mexican independence, was a mulatto. Right? And Morelia, for Morelos, who was also a mulatto.
Oh, okay.
So in Mexico City and other Mexican cities, the black population has historically, starting at the end of the colonial period, disappeared through mixture, right? That they did not keep a cultural presence, right? That signals them out as black, right? Outside of Guerrero and Veracruz. But you might still see people phenotypically black who present as black, or they mixture, which is in a way is the argument in the conclusion of the book, right? That Mexican culture, beginning with this cultural mixture, was to continue in such a way that this difference disappears. But in the colonial period, there was a large black population in Mexico City because there was a small free black population, but there was also a lot of labor depending. Blacks were involved in the 17th century. Blacks in Mexico City and throughout Mexico kind of had a monopoly on being coach drivers. So in 17th century painting, and we don't have a lot of blacks in painting from earlier centuries, but in 18th century painting, there's a famous painting of the center, right, the Zócalo, and all the activity is like it's a big religious festival, and you see all the important people in Mexico City arriving in coaches, and all the coach drivers are black, right? And the most important painter in Mexico, from colonial Mexico, Juan Correa, was a mulatto. There's another painter who was also a mulatto. He was an apprentice of Juan Correa. So I mean, blacks have been important for the development of Mexican culture. They were important. They existed in important numbers in Mexico City, and there's several books about blacks in Mexico City, and there is a new book about blacks in colonial Puebla.
Okay. Huh. I just yesterday I was talking to woman, a poet. Her name is Vanessa Angelica Villarreal. She's out of Texas originally, lives in SoCal, but an incredible poet. But she writes a lot about indigeneity, right? And I brought up the Octavio Paz line, and he said something about Mexicans are the la raza cósmica, something to that effect.
Right. So
And
that,
she
yeah,
right, and she really
it's a
gave
very, very common Mexican idea
uh-huh.
after the revolution. Yeah.
Right. She gave a very interesting take on it that I know is, backed by the scholarship, just this idea of like that it was meant with good intentions, but could definitely be seen as like an erasure of, right? Like an
Yes.
erasure of indigenous roots, an erasure of African roots, which is obviously not the positivity that's being
Right.
looked for there.
There
Speaking.
was, yeah, the Raza Cósmica, or the Mexican post-revolutionary government
Mm-hmm.
celebrated the Mexican mythical past, but
Right.
kind of erasing indigeneity, and blacks were, starting in the 19th century, erased from the national imaginary. And there, at the moment, there is a lot of research into the blacks in the history of Mexico.
Huh. Yeah.
Yeah, in Mexico itself, among Mexican scholars.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Right. You talk about the la casta, the caste system, within academics, right? About kind of arguing about, is it about race? How did Europeans see race? Right? Those type of things you write about. So it's interesting to talk about. Am I correct that it's vocales? Vocales with a B was the term used for um, Africans who were brought directly to the New World versus the Ladino.
Bozales. Bozales.
Bosales, excuse me, Bosales.
Which is a
And,
Muslim.
right,
Yeah.
right, for Boca, right? And
Yeah.
versus the Ladinos, which I know is used in different countries, different meanings, but
Right.
these were Africans, right, who who spoke Spanish, who grew up, lived in Portugal or España, those type of things, and then all the different racial caste systems, right? Peninsulares, criollos, and all of that. You write about that in a very interesting way. You write that quote Creole culture forms through cultural intimacies, right? Things like when there was a seemingly like teaming up of indigenous people, Nawal, and African people in doing some of the masks and doing the hunt, like like possibly mocking, but a togetherness there, the Creole. You write about the diaspora that had ceremonies established in the home continent and then they quickly, many back in Africa, you're saying quickly took to Christianity and European customs. And I know there's a lot to talk about there, right? Like how much of that is like, okay, we're just going to say it just to not make any waves, right? How many truly did and all of that, right? So, but I also want to talk about just those racial stratifications, racial categories. When you use that term mulatto, which I know is very loaded, is that African and indigenous? Is that African and European? Like talk about some of those, especially with the Spanish, right? And sorry, you're talking about how, especially like in Catholicism, right? There's this idea of like hombres de razón. I don't know the exact word, but like that, that Africans, that Black people were not people of reason. Indigenous were not people of reason, right? Talk a little bit about the culture, the social and racial caste system of Mexico specifically.
Yes. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on the subject. There's a great book called Before Mestizaje, which talks about race at the time before the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So there were the casta systems, but this idea of cultural intimacies, right, is that people, especially in distinct social stratas, were interacting with each other, mingling with each other, white, indigenous, blacks, right? So, for example, mulatto in Mexico was both the child of a black and a Spaniard,
Okay.
or an indigenous and a black, right? Because In Peru, a different word is used when the child is the product of an indigenous and a Black person. Sambago is used in Peru, which is where we get the word sambo, which is later used in the but which is still a word that is used in Peru.
Still a slur, right? I mean,
yes, it's a slur, and it's used in Peru. There's a Juan Vargas Llosa novel, La Conversación en la Catedral. This word is used a lot in the novel, and other Vargas Llosa novel, to refer to Black people. But so there was this mixture, which the book on Puebla talks about also, that people came together in the marketplace, right, and developed relationships, and Black communities developed strong relationship with Black communities, but they also had, maybe they were transactional, sometimes they were beyond transactional relations with other groups, right? And even these festivals, these public festivals, participating in these public festivals imply or require, right?
Yeah.
Transactional relations with other groups, among the groups, right? So this cultural intimacy coming together for one common purpose, right? Even if there is this discourse of difference, which is the casta system, right? So the casta system, you can think about it as a discourse of difference. And cultural intimacy, you can think of it as what's really going on.
Sure.
In terms of how people interact in their daily lives.
Sure. You obviously something that's very interesting about the book is, if we're talking Mexico specifically, I mean, there's a very big Catholic influence, right? I mean, Mexico, Brazil, some of the most Catholic countries in the world. The confraternity is cofrade the word in Spanish for confraternity?
Cofradía.
Cofradía. Yes. Cofrades are the gente, son
the members, right?
But you write really interestingly about these cofradías, some that were, like you said, probably transactional, and the Spanish sometimes kind of like, here, you have this power, but we were going to have somebody like oversee, or sometimes they were as independent as they could be amongst the African descent, those of African descent. But this idea of like venerating African and mulatto saints, generating community togetherness, helping the sick, the poor, the dying. I mean, mutual aid society, you hear that term a lot these days. I mean, that's exactly immediately what I thought about, right? A lot of great things that were done. You write, quote, this points to one of the main, what's that French? Raison d'être?
Yeah, raison d'être, reason for being.
Right. Of Black performances in the Americas, to recall, to keep Africa alive in the collective memory, and in so doing, to honor their ancestors. Black performances in the Atlantic, moreover, did not merely evoke the past, but projected themselves onto the present, not only as the performances of a desired sovereignty, but also of social and cultural agency, a self-fashioned sovereignty, etc., etc. You make that point about the joy, about the communities. I wonder then how much of these confraternities, how much of the performances, how much of the festivities were true performances of joy, and how much of it was a little bit like watching the back and saying like, hey, this is kind of like only for the outside to see. Does that make sense? Like how much acting was done, when there's a group of African descent, highlighting a European victory, how much of that is like, okay, we're going to kind of pull one over on them and pretend like we're into this, and how much of it was that true sovereign joy that you write about and talk about?
Yeah. So I mean, the participation in public festivals, of course, are not done just for the joy of it, right?
Okay.
They are, of course, to show loyalty, to ingratiate themselves, to give a positive image, right? To give a positive impression,
right?
To demonstrate them, to say in a way through gestures that they are part of the community, right? But we do not need to, I don't think that we need to think that it necessarily needs to be devoid of joy. But in general, this tradition because it was so widespread in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Brazil, where we have more example of this tradition,
Okay.
and elsewhere that we know of it, in Argentina, in Peru, in Panama. So we have from all those places records of Blacks participating in public festivals with this performance. But we have far more record of they doing it themselves, among themselves in their community, right?
Mm.
So this is a long tradition, right? In most Black community, this with the cofradías, this was an annual performance, right? This is something they created themselves. They brought together it's not doesn't come from one culture. It's a mixture of cultures,
Mm-hmm.
but it's something they put together themselves. It varies from place to place, right? It's not the same in Mexico City as in Brazil, but the tradition in every place has the same motifs, right? So that this was not something that was forced upon them, right? As it was something that they did as often as they could to express themselves in this way, right?
Mm.
And we know from all sorts of accounts, despite the prejudice that those accounts are and the exaltation that those accounts do, that these were joyous occasions, right? There was a crowning, whether it was mockery or something else, or both, right? There was dancing, there was eating. In some instances, there was comedy involved, right? So there is definitely, I have no doubt about the joy that was that this expressed, right? This was a joyous expression, right? Even when it's done as part of a transaction to ingratiate themselves with public authority,
Sure.
it need not be devoid of joy.
Right. Right. I wonder maybe if there was a person we should all look up. There was somebody maybe you didn't get to write a lot about, who was kind of a surprise to you or interesting to you that you read about that you read about in your own studies.
I mean, I wish I could find more about one guy, Francisco Loya, who is doing the crowning, or Martin, or another guy who Juan Bautista, who is being crowned, right? So who is being crowned? So there is in the performance. I studied the performance, but individuals themselves, there isn't very much information, right?
Right.
So
Right.
the wish would be to know more about this. I mean, I did write another article about a different Juan Bautista who because he wrote to the king several times, he left a long record, so you can follow that person
Okay.
and individualize that person. In the case of the performances, you can individualize them to say their name and what title they held in the performance. And in the case of whether they were free, you may know whether they were free. Melchora owned, that was her house, she owned it.
Yes.
Black women, free Black women in Latin America, in Colonial America, owned their houses, and so did some, but mostly women owned their houses. She hosted a party. It seemed that the house where they had that celebration, it was a sort of an inn, if you think of an inn in the old day, right? People come to eat, and according to this, there's accusation of gambling. But it's also her house is a place where those joyous things are taking place.
Sure.
On a more regular basis than one document let us show.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder. Thank you for that. I wonder if we could end with just like the process of writing a type of book like this. Like, I used to love like a history professor in college. He or she would like give a thesis like, hey, I'm going to prove this by the end. And then by the end, most of the time she did, and it was like a very like linear process in some ways. And there's also like maybe a healthy I don't know if competition is the word, but right. But you're positing, you have your own theses and hypothesis, etc. But you're also playing off what other people have written and agreeing or disagreeing. So I wonder, like, just the process of writing like an academic type book, a study type book that includes and also quote unquote competes against other scholars. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the process, of course, there is every process of writing your own poetry, your own novel, even an academic book, is finding your voice, right?
Hmm.
And as an academic, and the way I was trained, or the way I feel, if I'm writing about something, I want to read everything that has been written about this.
Right.
And so through the process of writing, the mentors that I had helped me find my own voice
Mm-hmm.
by having me rely on the scholarship, but now repeat the scholarship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just echo what I read.
Advance it, or
right. Advance it further, put my own voice. One of the things that I have learned from mentors in terms of academic writing is making bold statement, taking the risk, right? Making bold statement. I mean, the book has facts. There are indisputable facts in the books.
Sure.
But the book is also a debate, right? It's part of a debate, right? So not everything in the book is settled.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of a conversation, right? I'm adding to the conversation, and this is what I'm saying. I took the risk of saying what I'm saying. The book is certainly not free of factual errors or errors of logic, maybe. But so it was a great process of learning how to find my voice academically. Of course, you're plagued by insecurities when you write, and I was terrified. I'm still terrified of what that people are going to be reading a book I wrote and what's going to happen.
Well, congratulations. Like I said, talking to you has made me a lot smarter. Reading the book made me a lot smarter. I wish it didn't. I wish there weren't so many parallels to today. Right. I wish there weren't so many. I know there's a lot of talk about, recognizing people of African descent in Mexico, and for the census and all the things that entails, and it's just very current, very contemporary, even though it was written about something 400 or 500 years ago. So just overall, again, thank you for your time. Quiero darle a usted mis gracias, gracias mille. Quiero que tenga mucha suerte con el próximo libro. Y otra vez, muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a ti también. Ha sido un placer. And I look forward to the final product, and also to continue listening to your podcast. And congratulations for the great work you're doing through this podcast and through your teaching.
Wow, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Again, it's just been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time, and great luck in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.